A full day in the life of a World War II frontline soldier. Long before sunrise, your day begins beneath the earth. The dugout is little more than a cramped shelter carved into the side of a defensive position somewhere in Europe during the Second World War. It is dark, damp, and crowded. The air carries the smell of wet wool, mud, tobacco smoke, and men who have worn the same uniform for days or weeks. You wake not because you are fully rested, but because sleeping deeply on the front line is nearly impossible. Nearby, another soldier shifts beneath a blanket. Someone coughs. Another quietly adjusts his boots before stepping outside. The war is often remembered through major battles and famous generals, yet most soldiers spend far more time waiting than fighting. Historians estimate that frontline troops frequently experienced long periods of routine interrupted by brief moments of extreme activity. Much of military life involved maintaining positions, carrying supplies, repairing equipment, and simply enduring uncomfortable conditions. You sit up slowly. Your back aches from sleeping on rough boards or packed earth. Condensation has gathered along wooden beams overhead. During colder months, small drops of water may freeze during the night before melting again after dawn. Outside, the landscape remains hidden beneath darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thousands of other soldiers are beginning similar mornings. Most have never met one another. Many come from different towns, regions, or even continents. Yet their routines are surprisingly similar. A day on the front line rarely begins with action. Instead, it begins with small practical tasks. Boots must be checked, equipment must be gathered, water must be found. Every object has a place because losing even a simple item can create problems later. As the first hints of morning approach, you prepare to leave the relative safety of the dugout. But what exactly are soldiers carrying with them into another uncertain day? Stepping outside the dugout, you immediately feel the weight. A typical infantry soldier in World War II often carried between 50 and 80 pounds of equipment. The exact amount depended on the army, the mission, and the environment, but nearly everyone complained about the burden. The load begins with the uniform itself. Heavy boots, thick clothing, a steel helmet. Then come ammunition pouches, personal gear, water containers, eating utensils, medical supplies, and extra equipment assigned for specific duties. Many soldiers privately adjusted regulations whenever possible. If commanders required certain items but inspections were unlikely, some men quietly discarded less useful equipment to make marching easier. Others kept unusual personal objects. Family photographs were common. Small religious items appeared in many pockets. Some carried lucky charms whose importance would have seemed strange to outsiders. Weight becomes especially noticeable during long marches. Mud sticks to boots, effectively increasing the load with every step. Rain soaks clothing. Even paper letters become heavier when damp. Military planners devoted enormous effort to logistics because supplying frontline troops required a constant flow of food, fuel, ammunition, replacement clothing, and medical materials. Behind every soldier stood an immense network of drivers, mechanics, clerks, cooks, railway workers, and warehouse personnel. Yet, on the front line, these large systems often feel distant. What matters to you this morning is whether your canteen is full, whether your rifle functions properly, and whether your boots can survive another day. Around you, other soldiers quietly perform the same checks. Conversations remain brief. Most men are still waking up. Some stare silently into the grey light spreading across the landscape. The horizon slowly brightens. Soon breakfast will arrive, assuming supply routes remain open and weather conditions allow transport. For many soldiers, the first meal of the day becomes one of the most anticipated moments of military life. And surprisingly often, it comes from a simple metal can. Morning has fully arrived, though the sun remains hidden behind low clouds. The day begins with movement, not dramatic movement toward a famous battle, but the ordinary movement that filled much of a frontline soldier's life. Boots press into damp soil, equipment shifts against tired shoulders, belts are tightened, straps are adjusted for the 100th time. A soldier's equipment was not designed for comfort. Military planners focused on necessity. Every item had a purpose, and every purpose added weight. The steel helmet alone could feel heavier after hours of wear. Water bottles swung against the hip. Ammunition pouches rubbed against clothing. Entrenching tools used for digging defensive positions hung from belts or packs. Small personal items found space wherever possible. Many soldiers became experts at organizing equipment. A misplaced object could create frustration throughout the day. Finding a spoon in darkness or locating a spare bandage during rain required practice. Over time, muscle memory developed. Hands learned where everything belonged without needing to look. The weight affected posture, movement, and even personality. New recruits often struggled under heavy loads. Veterans learned small tricks. Some loosened straps during rest stops. Others shifted equipment from one shoulder to another. Every soldier eventually developed personal methods for enduring long days. The surprising reality of war is that endurance often mattered more than strength. The strongest soldier might become exhausted after carrying equipment for weeks. The most successful soldiers frequently learned how to conserve energy. As you walk along a muddy communication trench, carefully avoiding puddles that are impossible to fully avoid, you notice everyone carrying roughly the same burden. Yet not all weight can be measured in pounds. Some soldiers carry worries about families at home. Others think about friends transferred to different units. Some quietly count the days since they last received a letter. And as the morning continues, another kind of weight begins to demand attention, the constant search for food. Food occupies an enormous amount of a soldier's attention. Modern memories of World War II often focus on weapons, vehicles, and strategy. Yet countless letters and diaries reveal that ordinary meals dominated conversation far more frequently than military plans. Breakfast, when available, was welcomed with remarkable enthusiasm. Depending on the army and location, soldiers might receive bread, coffee, tea, biscuits, porridge, canned meat, or preserved foods designed to survive long transport routes. Fresh ingredients were treasured but often difficult to obtain near active front lines. Supply chains stretched across entire continents. Trains carried supplies to depots. Trucks carried supplies forward. Smaller vehicles delivered materials closer to combat zones. Finally, soldiers themselves often carried supplies the last distance. Any disruption could affect meals. Rain turned roads into mud. Snow blocked routes. Mechanical failures delayed deliveries. Enemy activity created additional complications. As a result, frontline soldiers learned flexibility. A meal expected at sunrise might arrive hours later. Hot food might arrive cold. Fresh bread might be replaced with hard biscuits. Yet even simple meals carried emotional importance. The arrival of a field kitchen could completely change the mood of a unit. Steam rising from large containers signaled something familiar in an unfamiliar environment. For a few minutes, soldiers could focus on eating instead of worrying. Many veterans later remembered meals in remarkable detail. Years after the war, they could still describe specific tastes, smells, and recipes. Food connected soldiers to normal life. It reminded them of kitchens, homes, and routines that existed far beyond the battlefield. As breakfast ends, cups are emptied, and equipment is gathered once more. The day is still young. Orders have not yet arrived, and on the front line, waiting often becomes its own kind of work. Waiting is one of the least discussed parts of military history. Films often compress events into continuous action. Real soldiers experienced something very different. Hours could pass with little visible change. Entire mornings might be spent preparing for events that never happened. After breakfast, units frequently entered periods of readiness. Weapons were inspected again. Defensive positions were checked. Messages moved between officers. Maps were reviewed. Observers watched distant terrain through binoculars. The work appeared repetitive because it was repetitive. Military organizations depended on routine. Routine reduced mistakes. Routine helped exhausted people function under pressure. Even when nothing seemed to happen, countless small tasks continued. You find a place near a trench wall and settle into another waiting period. Around you, soldiers pass time in familiar ways. Some write letters. Others repair clothing. A few read newspapers that may already be several days old. Conversations drift from hometown memories to complaints about weather. Weather remains a constant topic because it affects everything. Rain creates mud. Mud slows movement. Slow movement delays supplies. Delayed supplies affect food, equipment, and morale. Entire military campaigns have been influenced by weather conditions that seem unremarkable in history books. The hours move slowly, clouds shift overhead, occasionally distant sounds echo across the landscape. Most soldiers learn not to react immediately. Experience teaches patience. Not every sound signals danger. Not every rumor becomes reality. This ability to remain calm during uncertainty becomes one of the most valuable skills a soldier can develop. As afternoon approaches, new orders finally begin circulating through the position. Nothing dramatic, just another march, another movement, another long journey carrying everything you own across roads already worn by thousands before you. And as soldiers gather their equipment and prepare to move, one question quietly remains. How many miles can an ordinary person walk before exhaustion becomes part of daily life? Breakfast arrives with very little ceremony. There are no tables, no kitchens filled with conversation, and no familiar smells drifting through a family home. Instead, somewhere near the front line, a soldier receives a dented metal can that has travelled hundreds or perhaps thousands of miles before reaching his hands. The can itself is ordinary. During World War II, millions of identical containers crossed oceans, railways, roads, and battlefields. Entire industries existed to fill them with food, seal them, and ship them toward distant armies. For many soldiers, canned food became one of the defining experiences of military life. The contents varied depending on the nation, location, and year of the war. American soldiers might receive canned meat, beans, or processed meals. British troops often encountered preserved meats and biscuits. German soldiers relied heavily on preserved foods when supply systems allowed. Soviet troops frequently depended on whatever could be transported through enormous and often difficult logistical networks. You hold the can in cold hands. The label may already be damaged. Mud might cover part of the metal. Sometimes the contents are exactly what you hoped for. Sometimes they are not. Veterans often joked that opening a ration was like participating in a small lottery. The meal inside might be surprisingly satisfying or deeply disappointing. Still, hunger usually solved that problem. Many soldiers became skilled at improving basic rations. Extra salt, a borrowed ingredient, or a little creativity could transform a simple meal into something memorable. Tiny improvements carried enormous value because they broke the monotony. The war introduced millions of people to foods they might never have encountered otherwise. Soldiers from farms, cities, mountains, and coastal regions suddenly found themselves eating remarkably similar meals. As you carefully open the can and begin another ordinary breakfast, you become part of a global supply system so vast that few people at the time fully understood its scale. But who exactly made all this food, and how did it manage to reach the front at all? Far behind the front line, long before dawn reaches your position, thousands of workers are already awake. Factories operate around the clock. Railway employees load cargo. Warehouse workers organize shipments. Drivers prepare vehicles. Dock workers move supplies arriving from distant ports. Most of these people will never see the battlefield. Yet the survival of frontline soldiers depends heavily on their work. Military historians often describe logistics as the invisible backbone of war. Armies move only when supplies move. Food, fuel, medicine, ammunition, clothing, and replacement equipment must constantly flow forward. A single infantry division could require hundreds of tons of supplies every day. The challenge becomes even greater when weather interferes. Roads disappear beneath mud. Rivers flood. Bridges collapse. Snow blocks transport routes. Vehicles break down far from repair facilities. Every obstacle increases the difficulty of delivering something as simple as breakfast. Despite these challenges, supplies continue arriving with remarkable consistency. The process rarely feels impressive from the soldier's perspective. You simply receive a meal and continue with your day. Yet that simple meal represents thousands of individual decisions and countless hours of labor. Many soldiers understood this. Letters written during the war often expressed appreciation for packages sent from home. Homemade food, even in small amounts, carried emotional importance beyond its nutritional value. A piece of chocolate or a carefully packed cake connected soldiers to lives temporarily placed on hold. As you finish eating, empty cans begin accumulating nearby. Some will be discarded, others will find unexpected new uses. Soldiers frequently transformed empty containers into cups, storage containers, improvised stoves, or simple tools. Nothing useful was wasted if it could help tomorrow, and tomorrow always seemed to arrive quickly on the front line. The meal is over, the work continues, yet the next challenge waiting ahead is not hunger, but something much more familiar: walking. Military history is filled with famous vehicles. Tanks capture attention, aircraft dominate photographs, ships symbolize national power. Yet much of World War II was experienced on foot. An ordinary infantry soldier spent enormous amounts of time walking. Roads stretched endlessly across countryside and cities. Some were paved, many were not. Rain transformed paths into muddy channels. Dust-coated uniforms during dry seasons. Snow created entirely different difficulties during winter campaigns. The pace was rarely comfortable. Equipment added weight. Poor weather increased fatigue. Rest stops provided temporary relief, but never lasted long enough. Experienced soldiers learned to care for their feet with remarkable seriousness. Blisters could become genuine problems. Wet socks caused discomfort that lingered for days. A simple foot injury could reduce mobility and create larger difficulties for both the individual soldier and the unit. Veterans frequently described dry socks as one of the most valuable items imaginable. To someone far from the battlefield, that statement might seem strange. But after weeks of marching through mud, rain, and cold weather, small comforts acquired enormous significance. The march itself often encouraged reflection. Soldiers thought about home. They imagined future plans. They wondered where the war might carry them next. Long periods of movement created opportunities for quiet conversations and private thoughts. Not every memory of war involved danger. Many involved roads, long roads, endless roads. Roads disappearing into forests, villages, mountains, and horizons that seemed permanently out of reach. As the afternoon march continues, you notice the familiar rhythm of boots striking earth. Hundreds of soldiers move together, each carrying equipment, memories, and expectations for the future. The destination remains uncertain. The journey continues, and somewhere ahead, waiting beyond the next hill or the next village, another ordinary task is already demanding attention. What happens when the most important message in a soldier's life arrives at the front? Of all the vehicles arriving near the front, none attracts more attention than the mail truck. Food is important, ammunition is necessary, medical supplies are essential. Yet when word spreads that mail has arrived, soldiers often stop what they are doing and look toward the road. For a few moments, the war feels slightly farther away. Letters connect two worlds that rarely meet. On one side are muddy trenches, temporary shelters, and long marches. On the other are family kitchens, neighborhood streets, farms, factories, and ordinary lives continuing without them. You watch as bags of mail are unloaded. The process appears surprisingly simple. Names are called, envelopes change hands. Some soldiers receive several letters, others receive none. Those who receive letters often open them immediately. Paper unfolds carefully. Words written weeks earlier suddenly become part of the present. Many letters contain ordinary details. Family members describe weather, crops, local events, school activities, or neighborhood gossip. These topics may seem unimportant, yet they are often exactly what soldiers want to hear. Normal life becomes precious during wartime. A letter discussing a repaired fence or a neighbor's new bicycle offers something that military reports cannot provide. It reminds the reader that ordinary life still exists somewhere beyond the battlefield. Historians studying wartime correspondence frequently note how much effort people devoted to sounding cheerful. Families often softened bad news. Soldiers sometimes minimized hardships. Both sides attempted to protect each other from worry. As you observe men reading letters in near silence, you notice how completely their attention changes. For a few minutes, they are not focused on military duties. They are sons, brothers, husbands, fathers, and friends. Yet not everyone receives a letter today. And for those still waiting, the question remains: how long can a person hold on to hope when every delivery might bring news from home? The journey of a wartime letter was often extraordinary. A single envelope might travel through several countries before reaching its destination. It could move by train, truck, ship, aircraft, or even on foot. Military postal systems became vast organizations responsible for processing millions of pieces of mail. The people writing these letters rarely thought about the complexity involved. A mother sits at a kitchen table. A wife writes after putting children to bed. A friend sends news from a hometown cafe. The letters begin in familiar places, but soon enter an enormous transportation network. Postal workers sort names and unit numbers. Military clerks verify locations. Drivers carry bags of mail closer to the front. Sometimes letters arrive quickly. Sometimes they take weeks. Occasionally, they never arrive at all. Despite these difficulties, correspondence remained one of the most important morale boosters of the war. Governments understood this. Military leaders understood it as well. A soldier who felt connected to home often maintained better morale than one who felt forgotten. Many veterans later saved letters for decades. Some carried folded pages throughout entire campaigns. Others reread the same messages dozens of times until paper edges became worn and fragile. The physical object itself mattered, a familiar handwriting style, a signature at the bottom of a page, a photograph tucked inside an envelope. These small details provided reassurance during uncertain times. As afternoon slowly fades toward evening, soldiers continue reading and rereading messages. Conversations begin spreading through the camp. Someone shares news from home, another discusses a family photograph. For a brief period, the front line feels less isolated. Yet eventually, every letter is folded away. Duty returns. And the approaching night brings a different responsibility altogether. Who remains awake when everyone else hopes to sleep? Night changes the rhythm of military life. Contrary to what many people imagine, the entire front does not simply fall asleep after sunset. In many ways, darkness creates new responsibilities. As daylight disappears, soldiers prepare for night watch. Observation posts become especially important. Sentries are assigned positions. Patrol schedules are reviewed. Equipment is checked once again. You are assigned a watch shift. The hours ahead will be spent observing, listening, waiting. The task sounds simple but requires concentration. Darkness alters perception. Familiar landmarks become shadows. Distances become difficult to judge. Small sounds seem larger than they truly are. Veterans often described nighttime as psychologically different from daytime. The world feels smaller, vision becomes less reliable, hearing becomes more important. A rustling branch, a distant engine, footsteps that may belong to a fellow soldier or may not. Most nights pass quietly. That is another reality often overlooked in popular accounts of war. Long periods of routine observation frequently separated major events. Soldiers spent countless hours remaining alert even when nothing happened. The challenge was staying awake. Fatigue accumulated gradually. Many men had already spent the day marching, working, repairing equipment, or carrying supplies. Now they stood watch beneath cold skies. Some looked at stars when weather permitted. Others listened to insects, wind, or distant sounds drifting across the landscape. The world felt strangely peaceful at times, not because danger had disappeared, but because ordinary nature continued existing despite the conflict. Hours pass, the air grows colder. Somewhere behind the lines, letters rest inside pockets. Families sleep in distant homes. Trains continue carrying supplies through the darkness. And as you stand watch beneath a sky filled with stars, a quiet question remains unanswered. How did soldiers find warmth, comfort, and sleep after days that seemed to never truly end? As your watch finally ends, the cold seems heavier than your equipment. The nighttime air settles into uniforms, boots, gloves, and blankets. In many parts of Europe during World War II, soldiers spent months battling not only opposing armies but also rain, snow, freezing temperatures, and damp conditions that never seemed to disappear. Warmth becomes a daily objective. Not victory, not glory, simply warmth. You leave your observation post and return toward the dugout. The path is familiar by now. Mud freezes during cold nights and softens again during daylight. Every soldier learns where puddles form and which sections of ground remain relatively dry. Inside the shelter, several men are already asleep. Others are awake, quietly talking or preparing for rest. The dugout itself offers only limited protection from the weather. Wooden walls reduce wind. Earth overhead provides insulation. Yet cold still finds its way inside. Throughout the war, soldiers developed countless strategies for staying warm. Extra newspaper stuffed beneath clothing, Blankets layered together, shared body heat inside crowded shelters, hot drinks whenever available. Veterans frequently recalled how much thought they devoted to temperature. Small improvements felt enormously valuable. A dry pair of socks could improve morale for an entire day. The human body burns significant energy trying to remain warm. When food supplies were limited and weather was harsh, fatigue arrived more quickly. Military planners recognized this problem. Supplying winter clothing became a major logistical challenge. Gloves, coats, scarves, boots, and blankets all required manufacturing, transportation, and distribution, yet shortages were common. As you settle onto rough bedding and pull a blanket closer, the simple comfort of escaping the wind feels like a victory. Outside, darkness still covers the landscape. Inside, tired soldiers gradually drift towards sleep. But even in sleep, another challenge remains. How well can anyone truly rest when tomorrow will look almost exactly like today? Sleep on the front line is rarely continuous. Modern sleep studies emphasize quiet rooms, comfortable mattresses, and predictable schedules. Frontline soldiers had none of these advantages. Rest came whenever circumstances allowed. A soldier might sleep for several hours one night and only brief periods the next. Rotating duties, weather conditions, military operations, and simple overcrowding often disrupted normal routines. You close your eyes. Nearby, someone snores softly. Another soldier turns over, causing wooden boards to creak beneath his weight. The shelter occasionally vibrates from distant activity. Nothing dramatic, just reminders that thousands of people remain awake somewhere beyond the darkness. Historians examining wartime diaries often find references to exhaustion. Soldiers discussed sleep almost as frequently as food. The desire for uninterrupted rest became a constant companion. Some men could fall asleep almost instantly, others struggled. Letters from home lingered in their thoughts. Future plans occupied their minds. Concerns about family members remained impossible to fully ignore. Yet human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt. Over time, many soldiers learned to sleep in environments that would seem impossible to civilians. Railway stations, trucks, barns, trenches, forest clearings, temporary shelters. The body eventually accepts rest wherever rest becomes available. A few hours of sleep might not eliminate fatigue, but it provides enough energy to continue. This cycle repeated countless times throughout the war. Wake, work, wait, march, sleep, repeat. The routine rarely appeared in official reports. It generated few headlines. Yet it shaped daily life for millions of ordinary soldiers. As you drift towards sleep, one thought quietly emerges. Tomorrow's challenges will not involve dramatic battlefield maneuvers. Instead, they will involve something surprisingly ordinary. Work. And there is always more work waiting. Morning arrives once again. The cycle begins anew. Before any major operation can occur, hundreds of small tasks demand attention. Defensive positions require maintenance, equipment must be cleaned, supplies need organization, roads require repair, communication lines need inspection. War generates paperwork, it generates schedules, it generates endless lists of practical problems requiring solutions. You wake to another grey sky. The landscape looks almost unchanged from yesterday. Yet throughout the night, countless people have been working. Engineers repaired damaged roads, drivers transported supplies, cooks prepared meals, mechanics serviced vehicles, signal operators transmitted messages. Military organizations function because thousands of individuals perform repetitive tasks consistently. The frontline soldier witnesses only a small portion of this system. Still, its effects appear everywhere. Fresh supplies arrive, equipment functions, messages reach their destinations, food appears when conditions allow. Even during difficult periods, the machinery of logistics continues moving. This hidden world of labor rarely receives the attention given to famous battles, yet historians increasingly recognize its importance. Victory often depended not only on courage, but also on transportation, maintenance, planning, and organization. The ordinary worker mattered, the truck driver mattered, the mechanic mattered, the cook mattered, and the frontline soldier understood this better than most. As breakfast preparations begin and another day slowly unfolds, you realize that military life consists largely of interconnected routines. every task supports another. Every person depends upon someone else. The war feels enormous, yet daily life remains surprisingly small. One meal, one march, one letter, one night's sleep. And as the sun rises over the front line once more, another question quietly waits ahead. What did soldiers do during the long, uneventful hours when nothing seemed to happen at all? If you were to imagine a front line during World War II, you might picture constant action. Yet for many soldiers, the most common experience was waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for weather to improve, waiting for news, waiting for something to happen. The strange reality of military life is that long periods of inactivity often surrounded brief moments of intense activity. Entire days could pass without major events. Historians examining soldiers' diaries frequently encounter repeated entries describing ordinary routines rather than dramatic encounters. You find yourself with several hours and no immediate assignment. Around you, other soldiers respond in familiar ways. Some sit quietly and stare into the distance. Others repair equipment that does not necessarily need repair. Small maintenance tasks become a useful way to occupy time. A rifle is cleaned again. A strap is adjusted. A button is sewn back onto a uniform. One soldier sharpens a pencil with remarkable concentration. Another reorganizes his pack for perhaps the 5th time this week. The actions appear insignificant. Yet these small routines provide structure. Human beings generally dislike uncertainty. Repetitive tasks create a sense of control in environments where much remains unpredictable. Conversations drift through the position. Topics are rarely heroic. Weather remains popular. Food remains popular. Complaints about boots remain extremely popular. Many soldiers become experts in discussing ordinary subjects for surprisingly long periods. A familiar story from home may be told repeatedly. A favorite meal may be described in extraordinary detail. Small memories gain importance because they connect people to normal life. As morning gradually becomes afternoon, the pace remains slow. Nothing urgent demands attention. Nothing dramatic occurs. The hours stretch comfortably forward. Yet even during these quiet periods, soldiers continue finding ways to pass the time. And some of their favorite methods might seem surprisingly familiar today. How exactly did people entertain themselves when radios, books, and letters were sometimes the only distractions available? Entertainment on the front line was often simple. The resources available depended on location, supply conditions, and individual circumstances. Yet across different armies and different continents, soldiers frequently discovered similar ways to occupy long hours. Reading was extremely popular. Newspapers circulated from hand to hand until pages became worn. Books travelled remarkable distances. A single novel might pass through dozens of readers before finally falling apart. Magazines were equally valuable. Even old issues remained interesting because fresh reading material was often difficult to obtain. Card games appeared almost everywhere. A small deck of cards required little space and could provide endless variations of entertainment. Soldiers played during breaks, during poor weather, and whenever circumstances allowed. Some units organised sports. Others created informal competitions. Chessboards appeared. Checkers appeared. Improvised games emerged using whatever materials happened to be available. Music also played an important role. When instruments were available, soldiers sang familiar songs from home. Harmonica players became particularly appreciated because harmonicas were portable and durable. Perhaps most importantly, people talked. Long conversations filled countless hours, stories from childhood, descriptions of hometowns, plans for life after the war, speculation about what the future might hold. These conversations served a practical purpose beyond entertainment. They strengthened relationships within units and helped maintain morale during difficult periods. You notice one soldier carefully studying a letter for the 3rd time today. Nearby, another reads a book whose cover has nearly disappeared from use. A group of men gathers around a card game. For a little while, the atmosphere resembles a quiet community more than a military position. The war has not vanished. It simply feels distant. But eventually, every quiet afternoon reaches its end. And as shadows begin lengthening across the landscape, work returns once again. What happens when the routine task of maintaining equipment becomes one of the most important jobs on the entire front line? A dirty rifle can become a serious problem. This simple fact explains why soldiers spent so much time cleaning equipment. To an outside observer, maintenance might appear boring, yet military effectiveness depended heavily on reliability. Mud, dust, moisture, and constant use placed tremendous strain on equipment. Weapons required regular attention, boots required repair, uniforms needed patching, packs required adjustment. Small problems became larger problems when ignored. You sit with your equipment spread out nearby. The process is familiar. Metal surfaces are inspected, moving parts are checked, mud is removed from places where mud should not be. The work demands patience rather than excitement. Veterans often remembered maintenance routines because they occurred so frequently. Entire evenings might be devoted to cleaning, organizing, and preparing for tomorrow. The same principle extended beyond individual soldiers. Vehicles required mechanics, radios required technicians, field kitchens required maintenance crews. Even defensive positions required constant repair. Rain damaged trenches, wind damaged structures, heavy use wore down roads and pathways. Military organizations survived because people continuously fixed things before they completely failed. This endless cycle of maintenance rarely appears in dramatic wartime photographs. Yet without it, armies could not function. As daylight fades and equipment inspections conclude, soldiers begin preparing for another evening. The familiar rhythm returns: food, conversation, rest, and eventually sleep. But before darkness fully arrives, another group of workers begins one of the most important jobs on the battlefield. The people carrying messages through a world where communication could determine everything. And that raises an interesting question. What was life like for the radio operators who spent entire days listening to voices carried through the air? Long before smartphones, satellites, or the internet, armies relied on something that often felt almost magical: voices traveling through the air. Somewhere near the front line, hidden inside a small shelter, vehicle, or command position, a radio operator begins another day of listening. The work starts early. Unlike infantry soldiers who spend much of their day moving from place to place, radio operators remain closely connected to their equipment. Messages arrive at all hours. Information never fully stops moving. You enter a cramped communications position. The room is crowded with batteries, cables, notebooks, and radio equipment. Metal surfaces are worn from constant use. Wires run along walls and disappear through openings leading outside. The radio itself dominates the space. Large dials, headphones, switches, indicators. To an outsider, it might appear confusing. To the operator, every sound carries meaning. The day quickly settles into a familiar rhythm: listening, recording, transmitting, repeating. Many messages are routine: supply requests, position updates, weather reports, administrative information. Not every transmission changes the course of history. Most simply, help an enormous organization function from one hour to the next. This is one of the hidden realities of World War II. The war depended on communication just as much as it depended on weapons. Units needed information. Commanders needed reports. Supply officers needed updates. Without communication, confusion spread quickly. The radio operator becomes part of an invisible network stretching across towns, forests, rivers, and entire countries. You place the headphones over your ears. A mixture of voices, static, and distant signals fills the silence. Some transmissions are clear, others fade in and out, and as the morning continues, you begin to understand that listening itself can become exhausting. But how does someone remain focused when every hour sounds remarkably similar to the one before? Long before smartphones, satellites, or the internet, armies relied on something that often felt almost magical. Voices traveling through the air. Somewhere near the front line, hidden inside a small shelter, vehicle, or command position, a radio operator begins another day of listening. The work starts early. Unlike infantry soldiers who spend much of their day moving from place to place, radio operators remain closely connected to their equipment. Messages arrive at all hours. Information never fully stops moving. You enter a cramped communications position. The room is crowded with batteries, cables, notebooks, and radio equipment. Metal surfaces are worn from constant use. Wires run along walls and disappear through openings leading outside. The radio itself dominates the space. Large dials, headphones, switches, indicators. To an outsider, it might appear confusing. To the operator, every sound carries meaning. The day quickly settles into a familiar rhythm. Listening, recording, transmitting, repeating. Many messages are routine: supply requests, position updates, weather reports, administrative information. Not every transmission changes the course of history. Most simply help an enormous organization function from one hour to the next. This is one of the hidden realities of World War II. The war depended on communication just as much as it depended on weapons. Units needed information. Commanders needed reports. Supply officers needed updates. Without communication, confusion spread quickly. The radio operator becomes part of an invisible network stretching across towns, forests, rivers, and entire countries. You place the headphones over your ears. A mixture of voices, static, and distant signals fills the silence. Some transmissions are clear, others fade in and out. And as the morning continues, you begin to understand that listening itself can become exhausting. But how does someone remain focused when every hour sounds remarkably similar to the one before? Concentration is the most valuable skill a radio operator possesses. The work appears simple from a distance: sit, listen, write, repeat. Yet the reality is more demanding. A missed word can create confusion. A misunderstood coordinate can send information to the wrong location. A forgotten detail may force an entire message to be transmitted again. You spend hours wearing headphones. The sounds become strangely familiar. Static crackles continuously. Voices appear and disappear. Occasionally, atmospheric conditions affect signal quality. Weather, terrain, and distance all influence communication. Sometimes messages arrive perfectly. Sometimes they require repetition several times before being understood. Radio operators develop unusual habits. Many keep careful notebooks. Others create personal systems for organizing information. Some become remarkably skilled at recognizing voices they have never actually met face to face. Weeks of listening create familiarity, a particular accent, a specific speaking pattern, a favorite phrase. These details become recognizable over time. The work can also feel isolated. While infantry soldiers spend much of their day surrounded by others, radio operators often remain focused on equipment for long periods. Their world becomes defined by sounds rather than sights. Yet their importance is difficult to overstate. Throughout the war, successful communication frequently determined whether supplies arrived on time, whether units coordinated effectively, and whether commanders understood rapidly changing situations. Most messages remain routine. Most days pass without dramatic developments. Still, every transmission carries potential significance. The operator cannot know in advance which message will matter most, so attention remains constant. Hour after hour, notebook page after notebook page. And as afternoon slowly approaches, another question begins to emerge. When communication connects thousands of people across enormous distances, who ensures that everyone receives enough food to continue working? Even radio operators eventually become hungry, and hunger brings attention back to one of the most important yet overlooked groups in military history: the cooks. Every day, field kitchens worked to provide meals for large numbers of soldiers under difficult conditions. Unlike restaurants or civilian kitchens, military cooks often operated close to active front lines while managing unpredictable supply deliveries and changing circumstances. You step outside the communications shelter. The smell reaches you before the kitchen comes into view. Nothing extraordinary, just hot food. Yet after hours spent listening to static and distant voices, the smell feels welcoming. Field kitchens varied greatly depending on nation, location, and available resources. Some were mounted on vehicles, others operated from temporary shelters. Many had to move frequently. The challenges were constant: fuel shortages, weather problems, transportation delays, limited ingredients. Despite these obstacles, meals continued appearing day after day. Veterans often remembered cooks with surprising affection. A warm meal could improve morale more effectively than many official speeches. It provided comfort, routine, and a brief reminder of normal life. Around the kitchen area, soldiers gather patiently. Conversations return. Stories continue. Complaints about weather resume exactly where they left off earlier. The atmosphere feels almost familiar, almost peaceful. For a short time, ranks and responsibilities matter less than the shared experience of standing in line for food. This daily ritual repeats across countless military positions throughout the war, different uniforms, different languages, different countries, yet remarkably similar routines. As you accept another simple meal and look toward the evening sky, it becomes clear that much of military life revolves around necessities rather than battles: food, shelter, communication, rest. And tomorrow, another group of workers will begin their demanding routine before most soldiers have even awakened. The people whose job is keeping everyone fed. But what was a full day inside a World War II field kitchen actually like? The cooks are awake long before most soldiers. While much of the front line remains quiet and dark, activity has already begun around the field kitchen. Small lanterns glow softly through the darkness. Water is heated. Equipment is checked. Supplies are counted. For the cooks, the day often begins several hours before breakfast is served. You arrive while the sky is still black. The kitchen is not a restaurant. It is a practical workplace designed to solve a simple but difficult problem: feeding hundreds of hungry people in an environment where almost everything is unpredictable. Large containers stand ready. Fuel supplies are inspected. Ingredients are unpacked. The menu depends entirely on what has arrived through the supply system. Some mornings are better than others. Fresh bread might appear unexpectedly. Extra vegetables might arrive from nearby farms. Other days require cooks to work with preserved foods and limited options. Adaptability becomes an essential skill. Military cooks quickly learn that perfect meals are impossible. The goal is reliability. Soldiers need calories, warmth, and consistency. Around you, experienced kitchen workers move efficiently. Each person knows their responsibilities. One prepares ingredients. Another manages fuel. Someone else organizes distribution. The process resembles a carefully practiced routine repeated countless times. What surprises many people is the scale. Feeding one family is challenging enough. Feeding an entire military unit requires planning, organization, transportation, and timing. A delay of even a few hours can affect hundreds of people. As steam begins rising into the cold morning air, breakfast preparation continues steadily. The work is repetitive, demanding, often unnoticed. Yet before long, hundreds of soldiers will begin their day because of what happens here. And that raises an interesting question. How did cooks manage when supplies failed to arrive on time? Supply shortages were a constant concern. Military logistics during World War II operated on an enormous scale, but even the best systems experienced difficulties. Roads became impassable. Vehicles broke down. Weather interrupted deliveries. Bridges disappeared from maps faster than engineers could replace them. When supplies arrived late, cooks adapted. Flexibility became one of the most important skills in any field kitchen. You watch as inventory is carefully checked. Nothing is wasted unnecessarily. Every ingredient has value. Military cooks become experts at stretching available resources. A meal planned for one set of ingredients may need complete revision by midday. Creativity often matters as much as preparation. Soldiers understood these challenges. Complaints about food were common, but so was appreciation for anyone capable of producing a warm meal under difficult circumstances. A hot meal carried importance beyond nutrition. It created routine. It provided comfort. It offered a brief moment of normality. Historians frequently note that morale and food were closely connected. Soldiers who received regular meals generally maintained stronger spirits than those facing repeated shortages. Even simple foods acquired emotional significance. A fresh loaf of bread, a hot drink, a familiar recipe. Small comforts felt larger during wartime. Around the kitchen, activity continues throughout the day. Breakfast ends. Preparations for the next meal begin almost immediately. There is little downtime. Cleaning equipment, organizing supplies, and planning future meals consume much of the schedule. The work rarely receives public recognition, yet military organizations depend upon it completely. As afternoon approaches, the kitchen remains busy. The next meal is already being prepared. And nearby, another group of specialists begins preparing for an entirely different challenge, not feeding soldiers, saving them, but what was life like for the medics who spent their days responding whenever someone needed help? As evening slowly approaches, the field kitchen settles into a quieter rhythm. The largest meals have already been served. Equipment is cleaned, containers are washed, remaining supplies are counted once more. The workday, however, is not finished. Military kitchens rarely close completely. Unexpected needs can appear at any hour. Night patrols may require food. Drivers arriving late may need meals. Fresh supplies might arrive after dark. The kitchen remains ready. You sit nearby and observe the final tasks of the day. The atmosphere feels different from earlier, less hurried, more reflective. Many cooks spent years performing these routines. Their contribution rarely appeared in newspaper headlines or official speeches. Yet millions of soldiers remembered them, not because of famous achievements, but because they provided something everyone needed every single day: food, warmth, consistency. The foundations of daily life remained important even during global conflict. This pattern appears throughout history. Wars are often remembered through battles and leaders, yet ordinary workers quietly sustain the systems that make everything else possible. The cook preparing breakfast, the mechanic repairing a truck, the clerk processing supplies, the driver delivering cargo. Each person contributes to something larger than themselves. As darkness begins settling across the landscape once again, smoke from the kitchen drifts into the evening air. Another day is ending. Another will begin tomorrow. And somewhere nearby, a medic is preparing for a night that may bring very little sleep at all, because illness, accidents, and injuries do not follow schedules. They arrive whenever they choose. And that leaves an important question waiting in the darkness. What was it like to spend an entire day as a World War II frontline medic, always waiting for the next call for help? Before most soldiers wake, the medic is already awake. Not because an alarm has sounded, not because a schedule demands it, but because medical work on the front line never truly stops. Somewhere nearby, a soldier may have developed a fever. Another may have injured an ankle during a march. Someone else may need treatment for blisters that have gradually become impossible to ignore. The popular image of wartime medics often focuses on dramatic moments, yet much of their daily work involved ordinary medical problems. You enter a small aid station near the front. The shelter is modest: wooden tables, medical bags, bandages, boxes of supplies stacked carefully against walls. The space feels practical rather than impressive. Everything exists for a purpose. A medic's responsibilities are surprisingly broad: minor illnesses, cuts and scrapes, foot problems, exhaustion, infections. Routine health concerns remain constant even during wartime. Many soldiers march long distances under difficult conditions. Boots remain wet for days. Sleep is often limited. Nutrition varies depending on supply conditions. All of these factors create medical challenges. You watch as a medic examines a soldier's feet. The task seems simple. Yet experienced medical personnel understood that untreated foot injuries could affect an entire unit's mobility. Throughout military history, armies have often suffered more from disease and poor health than from direct combat. This reality shaped military planning for centuries. Clean water mattered, hygiene mattered, preventive care mattered. As morning continues, the aid station grows busier. A steady stream of soldiers arrives with concerns both large and small. Most will receive treatment and return to duty. Others may require additional care. And through it all, the medic remains focused. Patient after patient, problem after problem, hour after hour. But how does someone remain effective when every day brings an endless list of people needing help? Patience becomes one of the medic's greatest skills. Unlike many military roles that focus on equipment or positions, medical work focuses on people. Every patient is different. Every complaint requires attention. Every decision matters. The day progresses steadily. One soldier needs treatment for a persistent cough. Another arrives with a hand injury caused while repairing equipment. A third seeks advice about recurring pain that has been ignored for weeks. Many cases are not emergencies, yet they still require care. Military medics quickly learn that small problems rarely remain small forever. Treating an issue early often prevents larger complications later. You notice how carefully records are maintained: names, symptoms, treatments, recommendations. Documentation helps create continuity in a constantly changing environment. The work can become repetitive, yet repetition does not reduce its importance. Historians studying military medicine often emphasize how advances in organization, sanitation, and preventive care improved survival rates during the 20th century. Many of these improvements occurred quietly. No dramatic announcements, no public celebrations, just thousands of medical workers consistently applying practical knowledge. Outside the aid station, military life continues. Trucks move supplies, soldiers perform maintenance, field kitchens prepare meals. Inside, the medic remains focused on individual needs. The contrast is striking. A global conflict involving millions of people often narrows to a single patient sitting across a table. One person, one problem, one solution. And as afternoon slowly turns toward evening, the work shows no sign of ending, because medical care does not stop when the sun goes down. In many ways, the longest hours are still ahead. What happens when darkness arrives and the medic remains on duty? Night settles across the front line. The aid station grows quieter, but it does not become silent. Medical work rarely follows predictable schedules. A knock on the door, footsteps outside, a vehicle arriving unexpectedly. The medic learns to respond without hesitation. You sit inside the shelter as evening stretches into night. A lantern casts soft light across medical supplies. The atmosphere feels calm, almost peaceful, yet readiness remains constant. The medic may rest briefly, but never completely. Experience teaches that situations can change quickly. Many veterans later described medical personnel as some of the most dependable individuals they encountered during the war. Not because they were fearless, not because they were extraordinary, but because they consistently appeared when needed, day after day, night after night. Their work required technical knowledge, emotional resilience, and remarkable endurance. Most of it occurred far from public attention. There were no cheering crowds, no headlines, just responsibility. And responsibility has a way of arriving at inconvenient times. As midnight approaches, the aid station remains prepared. Bandages are organized, equipment is ready, records are updated. The next patient could arrive at any moment, or perhaps the night will remain quiet. No one knows. That uncertainty becomes part of the routine. One more challenge to accept, one more reality of frontline life. Outside, stars appear above the dark landscape. Inside, a medic waits patiently, prepared for whatever tomorrow may bring. And somewhere beyond the aid station, another group of soldiers is already beginning tomorrow's work. They are carrying shovels instead of medical bags, because trenches collapse, roads deteriorate, defenses require constant attention, and that leads to another surprisingly important question. What was an ordinary day like for the soldiers whose job was building and repairing the front line itself? Story 10. Building and repairing defenses. When people imagine World War II, they often picture movement, advancing armies, retreating armies, columns of tanks crossing vast landscapes. Yet much of military life involved staying in one place and making that place safer. That work began with a shovel. You wake before sunrise and join a group of soldiers assigned to engineering and defensive maintenance duties. The tools are simple: shovels, picks, axes, saw blades, lengths of wire. None of them appear particularly impressive. Yet throughout military history, these tools have shaped battlefields as surely as weapons. The front line is never finished. Rain damages trenches, wind weakens structures, heavy foot traffic wears down paths and defensive positions. Every day, repairs become necessary. You begin digging. The soil is damp from recent weather. Each shovel of earth feels heavier than expected. After an hour, your shoulders ache. After several hours, the work becomes almost automatic. Dig, lift, move, repeat. Veterans frequently recalled how much time they spent digging during the war. Trenches provided protection from weather, observation, and various battlefield dangers. A well-built position could dramatically improve a unit's ability to function. Many soldiers joked that they became part-time construction workers. The joke contained more truth than exaggeration. Entire days could disappear into maintenance projects. New shelters, improved drainage, expanded communication trenches, reinforced walls. The work rarely appeared in official photographs. Yet it transformed ordinary ground into something more useful. As the morning slowly progresses, a network of positions begins taking shape beneath countless hours of labor. And standing there with a shovel in your hands, you begin to wonder, how did soldiers stay motivated when the work never truly seemed finished? The answer is surprisingly simple. Most soldiers worked because the alternative was worse. A deeper trench offered more protection. A stronger shelter stayed standing longer. A repaired drainage system reduced flooding after rain. The benefits were immediate and practical. You spend the afternoon improving a section of defensive line that has suffered damage from recent weather. Mud has collected in low areas. Wooden supports need replacement. Water has found pathways into places where water is definitely not wanted. The challenge with defensive construction is that nature never stops working against you. Rain returns, soil shifts, wood ages, metal rusts. Every improvement eventually requires maintenance. Military engineers understood this reality very well. Throughout the war, enormous amounts of labor were devoted to keeping positions functional rather than creating entirely new ones. You notice experienced soldiers working efficiently. They know which repairs matter most. They understand where drainage problems will appear. They recognize weak points before they become serious issues. Knowledge gained through experience often proves more valuable than strength alone. As hours pass, conversations continue around the work site. Topics remain familiar: food, weather, home, future plans. The routine of manual labor encourages discussion. The work becomes easier when shared. By late afternoon, visible progress has been made. The trench is deeper, the supports are stronger. Water now flows away from important areas. It is not exciting work. It is useful work. And usefulness often matters more than excitement. The sun begins lowering toward the horizon. Tools are collected, materials are organized. Another day of construction is ending. Yet one final task remains before darkness arrives: a careful inspection, because even small mistakes can create larger problems later. And that raises an interesting question. What happened during the quiet evening hours after the day's labor finally came to an end? Evening brings a different kind of work. The heavy labor has ended, but responsibilities remain. You walk slowly through the repaired positions. Inspection becomes the final task of the day. Military organizations depend heavily on routine checks. A trench that appears stable today may develop problems tomorrow. A support beam that seems secure may weaken over time. Small issues become large issues when ignored. As the inspection continues, you begin noticing details that would have escaped attention earlier. The angle of drainage channels, the placement of wooden reinforcements, the condition of pathways connecting different sections of the position. Each detail contributes to the overall effectiveness of the defensive system. History often remembers great offensives and famous battles, yet many military successes depended on preparation completed long before those events occurred. Someone built the shelter, someone repaired the road, someone reinforced the trench, someone maintained the communication line. The cumulative effect of thousands of ordinary tasks shaped outcomes in ways that were rarely obvious at the time. As darkness spreads across the landscape, the worksite grows quiet. Shovels are stored, tools disappear into sheds and shelters. The freshly repaired defenses stand ready for another day. Nearby, soldiers begin settling into familiar evening routines. Some prepare food, others write letters. A few simply sit and enjoy a rare moment of rest. The atmosphere feels calm. The day's labor is complete. Tomorrow will bring more work, because there is always more work. But for now, there is only the cool evening air and the satisfaction of a task finished. And as you look across the network of trenches disappearing into the darkness, another question quietly emerges. What happened when rain arrived and turned the entire front line into a sea of mud? The rain begins sometime during the night. Not a dramatic storm, not thunder or lightning, just a steady, patient rainfall that continues hour after hour. By morning, the entire landscape feels different. Paths have softened. Trenches contain puddles. The air smells of damp earth and wet wood. You wake to the familiar sound of water dripping from somewhere above. For frontline soldiers, rain was rarely welcomed. A single day of bad weather could create inconveniences. Several days of continuous rain could transform everyday life. Boots become heavier, clothing takes longer to dry, equipment requires extra maintenance. Simple tasks suddenly demand more effort. You step outside the shelter and immediately notice the mud. It clings to everything. Boots sink deeper with each step. Wheels struggle for traction. Pathways that seemed perfectly acceptable yesterday now resemble small rivers. Military records from every major army contain countless references to weather. Generals discussed it, quartermasters worried about it, drivers complained about it, ordinary soldiers lived with it. Rain influenced transportation, supply delivery, construction projects, communication systems, and morale. The weather did not care about schedules, it arrived when it wished. You begin another day moving carefully across slippery ground. Around you, everyone seems slightly slower than usual. The reason is simple. Mud adds weight, effort increases, energy disappears more quickly, and after only a few hours, one particular problem becomes impossible to ignore. Your boots are completely soaked. The question now becomes, how did soldiers deal with wet feet when dry footwear was often impossible to find? To modern readers, discussions about socks may seem strangely unimportant, yet veterans frequently describe dry socks as one of the greatest luxuries imaginable. The reason becomes obvious after several days of rain. Wet feet create discomfort. Discomfort creates fatigue. Fatigue affects everything else. Military medics paid close attention to foot care because neglected problems could quickly become serious. Blisters, infections, and skin conditions became more common when soldiers spent long periods wearing wet boots. You sit beneath a shelter during a brief break. Nearby, several soldiers have removed their boots. Socks hang from improvised drying lines. Steam rises from a small stove. Everyone is trying to achieve the same goal. Dryness. It sounds simple. It often wasn't. Some soldiers stuffed newspapers into boots overnight. Others rotated between different pairs of socks whenever possible. A few developed personal routines that they followed with almost religious dedication. Veterans often shared foot care advice with new arrivals, not because it was exciting, because it worked. Military life repeatedly demonstrated that small practical habits could make enormous differences over time. The same principle applied to clothing. Wet uniforms felt colder. Cold clothing reduced comfort. Reduced comfort affected morale. A single dry blanket could transform an entire evening. Historians studying wartime diaries frequently encounter surprisingly detailed descriptions of weather conditions. The reason is straightforward. Weather affected daily life more consistently than almost anything else. A soldier might not encounter major military action every day, but rain could arrive every day. As afternoon approaches, the sky remains grey. Clouds continue moving slowly overhead. The ground shows little sign of drying, and despite everyone's efforts, another challenge is quietly developing: the cold. Because once temperatures begin dropping, wet conditions become much more difficult to endure. How did soldiers stay warm when both their clothing and their surroundings seem determined to remain damp? Evening arrives early beneath heavy clouds. The temperature begins falling. The rain finally slows, but the moisture remains everywhere. Wood is damp. Earth is damp. Clothing is damp. The front line feels wrapped in a layer of cold humidity. You gather near a small heat source along with several other soldiers. No one says much. The simple presence of warmth commands attention. Hands extend toward the heat. Boots are positioned nearby. Wet gloves rest on improvised drying racks. Across every front of World War II, scenes like this repeated endlessly. People searching for comfort in difficult conditions. Not luxury, not convenience, just warmth. The search for warmth shaped countless decisions. Where to sleep, how to organize shelters, which routes to use during bad weather, when to change clothing. These practical considerations occupied enormous amounts of attention. Military history often focuses on strategy, yet ordinary soldiers frequently focused on temperature. They worried about tomorrow's weather forecast. They discussed incoming storms. They hoped for clear skies. The weather became part of daily life in a way that civilians rarely experience today. As darkness settles fully across the position, the atmosphere grows quieter. Rainwater continues dripping from rooftops and tree branches. The air smells faintly of damp soil and wood smoke. Some soldiers write letters, others clean equipment. A few simply sit and enjoy the rare comfort of being warm. Tomorrow may bring sunshine, or more rain. No one knows. That uncertainty becomes another routine part of military life. And as you settle into your shelter for the night, listening to distant sounds carried by the wind, one final thought lingers. After long days of work, marching, maintenance, and waiting, what did soldiers think about when they sat quietly with nothing to do except remember home? As evening settles over the front line, the pace of the day finally begins to slow. The tools have been put away. The meals have been eaten. The maintenance tasks are mostly complete. For a brief period, soldiers have something that often feels rare during wartime. Time to think. You sit inside a dim shelter, illuminated by a lantern whose flame gently flickers with every movement of air. Around you, conversations rise and fall in quiet waves. Some men play cards, others clean equipment for tomorrow. A few are reading letters. One soldier unfolds a piece of paper so carefully that it seems almost fragile. The letter has likely been opened many times before. The folds are worn. The edges are soft from handling. Yet every word remains valuable. Letters from home provided something no military supply system could manufacture: connection. The war separated millions of people from familiar places and familiar routines. Many soldiers had not seen their families for months or even years. A letter helped bridge that distance. The contents were often surprisingly ordinary: descriptions of weather, updates about crops, news about neighbors, stories about school, work, pets, or local events. To someone far removed from the front line, these details might appear insignificant. To a soldier, they were priceless. They confirmed that ordinary life still existed somewhere beyond the mud, uniforms, and endless routines of military service. You watch as another soldier quietly smiles while reading. Perhaps someone back home mentioned an old memory. Perhaps they described a favorite meal waiting for him after the war. Perhaps they simply wrote that they missed him. The specific words matter less than the feeling they create. For a few moments, the front line seems farther away. But eventually every letter reaches its final sentence. And when the reading is finished, another question quietly remains. What happened when soldiers decided to write back? Writing a letter sounds simple. Finding the right words often wasn't. You sit with paper balanced carefully on your knee. The lantern provides just enough light. Around you, several other soldiers are doing exactly the same thing. Pens scratch quietly across paper. The challenge is deciding what to say. Many soldiers deliberately softened their descriptions of daily life. They did not want families worrying unnecessarily. Instead of describing exhaustion, they might mention being tired. Instead of discussing difficult weather, they might simply mention rain. Letters became exercises in reassurance. Families at home often did the same thing. Both sides attempted to protect one another. Historians who study wartime correspondence frequently notice this pattern. Many letters focused on ordinary routines rather than major concerns. A mother describes her garden. A father discusses repairs around the house. A friend writes about local events. A soldier responds with stories about daily activities, meals, or amusing incidents. The result is surprisingly human. Beneath the enormous scale of World War II existed millions of small conversations between ordinary people trying to remain connected. You begin writing. The process encourages reflection. What has happened recently? What memories deserve sharing? What future hopes seem worth mentioning? Some soldiers write quickly. Others spend long periods staring at blank paper before beginning. A letter carries weight because it may be read many times. Every sentence matters. Every detail becomes part of a shared history between people separated by great distances. Eventually, the page fills. The letter is folded. The envelope is sealed. Tomorrow, it will begin its long journey home. But after the writing is finished and the lantern light grows dimmer, another thought begins to emerge. What did soldiers imagine their lives would look like after the war finally ended? The future appears frequently in frontline conversations. Not because anyone knows exactly what it will bring, because imagining the future provides comfort. You sit quietly while the evening grows later. Nearby, several soldiers discuss plans. One hopes to return to farming. Another talks about opening a business. Someone else dreams of traveling. The details differ. The pattern remains the same. People naturally look beyond present difficulties. Throughout the war, soldiers carried not only equipment and responsibilities, but also expectations for life afterward. Many imagined simple things: sleeping in their own bed, eating meals with family, walking familiar streets, returning to routines that had once seemed ordinary. The dreams were rarely extravagant. Normality itself had become valuable. Historians often note how frequently veterans remembered everyday experiences after returning home. A quiet breakfast, a comfortable chair, a peaceful evening. These moments gained significance because they had been absent for so long. As the conversation continues, you realize something important. Even on the front line, people remained focused on life rather than conflict. They talked about homes, families, jobs, friendships, the future. The war occupied their present, but it did not completely define their identity. Outside, the night grows still. The stars appear between drifting clouds. Inside the shelter, the last conversations begin fading into silence. Tomorrow will bring more routine tasks, more work, more waiting, more small moments that history books rarely mention. Yet those ordinary moments shaped the experience of millions. And as you prepare for sleep, one final question remains waiting for the next day. When darkness covered the battlefield and most soldiers rested, who stayed awake watching over everyone else? Most soldiers hope to sleep through the night. A few know they will not. As darkness settles over the front line, duty rosters are checked and assignments are quietly announced. While others prepare blankets and search for comfortable positions inside shelters, the men assigned to night watch gather their equipment and prepare for several hours of observation. You are one of them. The task sounds simple. Remain awake, observe, report anything unusual. In practice, it requires patience, discipline, and concentration. The landscape looks entirely different after sunset. Familiar paths become shadows. Trees merge into dark shapes. Distances become difficult to judge. Objects that seem obvious during daylight almost disappear. You walk toward an observation position. The air is cool. The ground remains damp from earlier rain. A faint breeze moves through nearby trees. The sounds of daytime activity have mostly disappeared. Vehicles are quieter. Conversations are fewer. The world feels smaller. Night watch often involved long periods where nothing happened at all. Historians examining soldiers' diaries frequently encounter descriptions of boredom rather than excitement. Yet boredom could never become carelessness. The entire purpose of the watch was awareness. A distant light, an unfamiliar sound, unexpected movement. Anything unusual required attention. You settle into position and begin scanning the darkness. Minutes pass slowly, then more minutes. Time behaves differently at night. Without constant activity, every hour seems longer than the last. The stars emerge overhead. Clouds drift across the moon. The landscape remains quiet, almost too quiet. And after enough silence, a curious question begins to form. What exactly does a soldier think about during hours spent staring into darkness? Night watch creates unusual opportunities for reflection. During the day, military life remains busy. Tasks compete for attention. Equipment requires maintenance. Orders require action. Conversations fill empty moments. At night, much of that disappears. You remain alert, but your mind still wanders. Veterans often describe these hours as surprisingly thoughtful. The darkness encourages memory. People think about home, family members, favorite places, future plans, old friends. The mind naturally drifts toward familiar subjects. Around the world, countless soldiers experienced similar thoughts during long night watches. Different languages, different uniforms, different armies. Yet many reflections were remarkably alike. What would life look like after the war? How much had changed back home? Would familiar places still feel familiar? The questions rarely had immediate answers. Still, people continued asking them. You shift positions slightly. The cold begins returning. Somewhere nearby, another sentry watches a different section of the line. Communication remains limited. Everyone focuses on their assigned area. A distant animal moves through brush. For a brief moment, the sound captures your attention. Then silence returns. The ability to distinguish ordinary sounds from unusual ones becomes an important skill. Experienced soldiers gradually learn the rhythm of a landscape. Wind has a certain sound, rain has another. Wildlife creates patterns that become familiar over time. Anything outside those patterns attracts notice. The work remains uneventful. That is usually considered a success. Yet even successful watches eventually come to an end. And as the hours pass, another challenge begins emerging: fatigue. Because remaining awake through the coldest hours of the night is often harder than it sounds. How did soldiers stay alert when their bodies desperately wanted sleep? The hardest part of night watch often arrives just before dawn. The temperature reaches its lowest point. The darkness feels longest. Fatigue becomes difficult to ignore. You stamp your boots lightly against the ground to stay warm. Nearby, another soldier adjusts his coat collar. Everyone is fighting the same battle, not against an enemy, against sleep. Military organizations developed countless methods to help soldiers remain alert. Watch schedules were carefully organized, duties rotated whenever possible, fellow soldiers checked on one another. Still, staying awake required effort. Cold air helped, movement helped, conversation sometimes helped. Experienced soldiers often developed personal routines, small habits repeated night after night, anything that made the hours pass more comfortably. Gradually, the horizon begins changing. The black sky softens into dark grey. Shapes become easier to recognize. Trees regain their outlines. The landscape slowly returns. Dawn is approaching. For many centuries, sunrise brings a feeling of quiet satisfaction. Another watch completed. Another responsibility fulfilled. No headlines will celebrate it. No history book will describe it. Yet countless successful days depended upon thousands of ordinary watches performed by ordinary people. The final stars disappear. Birds begin their morning routines. Activity slowly returns across the front line. Some soldiers are waking. Others are already beginning work. The cycle continues. As you leave the observation post and make your way back toward camp, a new day is beginning exactly where the previous one ended. And with that new day comes another challenge that every soldier understood well: the constant search for small comforts in a difficult environment. Because when almost everything feels temporary, even the smallest luxury can become unforgettable. And that raises an interesting question. What were the simple comforts that frontline soldiers valued more than almost anything else? The history of war is often told through grand events: battles, campaigns, generals, maps covered with arrows. Yet for ordinary soldiers, happiness was often measured in much smaller ways: a dry pair of socks, a hot drink, a letter from home, a few uninterrupted hours of sleep. As the morning begins, you notice how frequently conversations return to these simple comforts. The reason is obvious. Large events are usually beyond your control. Small comforts are immediate. They are real. You sit near a field kitchen holding a metal cup filled with hot coffee or tea. The exact drink depends on the army and location. What matters is the warmth. Steam rises into the cool morning air. Your hands absorb heat through the metal cup. For a brief moment, nothing else requires attention. Veterans frequently described hot drinks with remarkable affection. Many remembered specific mornings decades later, not because the beverage was extraordinary, but because it provided comfort during difficult circumstances. The same pattern appears throughout military history. People learn to appreciate ordinary things when those things become scarce: a warm meal, a clean blanket, a sheltered place to sit during rain. These experiences often carried more emotional weight than outsiders might expect. Nearby, soldiers begin discussing food from home. The conversation grows increasingly detailed. Favorite breads, family recipes, holiday meals. Everyone seems to have a story. Everyone remembers a particular taste. Memory becomes a kind of comfort as well. The ability to revisit familiar experiences, even briefly, helps make difficult days more manageable. And as the morning continues, another question emerges. What happened when soldiers found ways to create entertainment from almost nothing at all? Boredom encourages creativity. Throughout World War II, soldiers invented countless ways to entertain themselves during quiet periods. You find a small group gathered near a shelter. Someone has produced a deck of cards. Another person keeps score using a pencil worn almost to the end. The game itself is not particularly important. The activity is. Hours pass more comfortably when shared. Military camps often developed their own traditions. Inside jokes, nicknames, friendly competitions. Small rituals repeated day after day. These customs helped transform groups of strangers into communities. Humor played an important role as well. Veterans frequently recalled laughter even during difficult periods. Jokes about weather, food, equipment, and military bureaucracy appeared everywhere. The humor was rarely sophisticated. That was not the point. The purpose was relief. For a few moments, people could focus on something other than responsibility. Books remained valuable. Music remained valuable. Conversation remained valuable. Simple activities acquired greater significance because alternatives were limited. You notice one soldier carefully teaching another a card game. Nearby, someone is reading aloud from an old magazine. A few others are simply sitting together, watching clouds move across the sky. Nothing dramatic is happening, yet these moments matter. Human beings are social creatures. Shared experiences create resilience. The ability to laugh, talk, and relax helps people endure challenges that would otherwise feel overwhelming. As afternoon drifts toward evening, the atmosphere remains calm. The day feels ordinary. And in many ways, that ordinariness is exactly what everyone wants. But eventually the sun begins lowering once again. And with evening comes reflection. What comforts did soldiers remember most after the war was finally over? Years later, many veterans struggled to remember exact dates. Specific orders faded. Some locations became difficult to recall. Yet small comforts remained surprisingly vivid. A particular cup of coffee, a warm shelter during a storm, a letter received on a difficult day, a conversation with friends while waiting for nothing in particular. You sit quietly as evening settles over the front line. The sky turns shades of orange and grey. Activity slows. The familiar rhythm returns. Equipment is organised. Meals are finished. Night preparations begin. Around you, soldiers continue their routines. Most do not realise that these ordinary moments will become lasting memories. History often focuses on exceptional events. People frequently remember ordinary ones. The reason may be simple. Extraordinary moments are rare. Ordinary moments fill most of life. The soldiers sitting together this evening are not thinking about future historians. They are thinking about tomorrow's weather, tomorrow's duties, and whether the next mail delivery might bring news from home. Yet these small concerns create the texture of daily life. They reveal how people adapted to uncertainty, how they maintained morale, how they preserved a sense of normality despite unusual circumstances. The stars begin appearing overhead. Another day is ending. The front line grows quieter. Tomorrow will likely resemble today in many ways. Work, waiting, food, conversation, rest. The cycle continues, and as darkness settles across the landscape once more, one final question quietly appears. After months or years of repeating these routines, what did it feel like when the war finally began drawing to a close? For most soldiers, the end of the war did not arrive all at once. There was no single morning when everyone woke up and immediately understood that the conflict was nearly over. Instead, the change arrived gradually. Rumours spread through camps. Newspapers carried encouraging headlines. Officers spoke cautiously about recent developments. Maps began showing familiar front lines moving in new directions. You notice these changes slowly. The daily routine remains largely the same. Boots still need cleaning. Equipment still requires maintenance. Meals still arrive from the field kitchen. Night watches still take place. Yet, beneath these familiar activities, something feels different. Conversations begin changing. Soldiers who once focused entirely on surviving the next week now spend more time discussing the future. Questions appear everywhere. When might we go home? What will happen afterward? How long will it take? Nobody knows the answers. The uncertainty creates both excitement and caution. Veterans often recalled being reluctant to celebrate too early. They had seen situations change before. Rumors could be wrong, predictions could fail. Experience encouraged patience, so daily life continued. The front line still demanded attention, orders still arrived, responsibilities still mattered, yet hope had become more visible. You see it in conversations, you hear it in laughter, you notice it whenever people discuss plans that had once seemed impossibly distant. For years, many soldiers had focused on the immediate present. Now they were beginning to imagine life beyond the war. And that raises an interesting question. After spending so long living according to military routines, how easy was it to imagine returning to ordinary civilian life? The answer was not always simple. Many soldiers had spent years adapting to military schedules. Wake at a certain time, perform assigned duties, follow established routines, respond to changing circumstances. The structure became familiar. You sit with several soldiers during a quiet afternoon. The discussion turns toward home. Everyone has ideas. Some are practical, others are ambitious. One man wants to return to farming. Another hopes to continue his education. Someone else plans to start a business. The dreams vary greatly, yet a common theme connects them. Normality. People miss ordinary life, not because ordinary life is exciting, because it is familiar. Historians studying wartime letters often find surprisingly modest hopes for the future. Many people simply wanted stability, a permanent home, regular work, meals shared with family, freedom from uncertainty. The war had disrupted countless lives. Now millions were beginning to imagine rebuilding them. You notice how carefully these conversations unfold. Hope exists, but so does caution. No one wants disappointment. No one wants to assume too much. The future remains uncertain until it arrives. Still, the discussions continue. The possibility of peace has become real enough to talk about openly. That alone feels significant. As evening approaches, the camp grows quieter. People remain thoughtful. The war is not entirely finished. Not yet. But the possibility of an ending now feels closer than ever before. And as darkness returns, another question begins forming. What happened on the day soldiers finally learned that the fighting was over?